Hello and welcome to the Northern Agenda podcast, coming to you from Reach, the people behind the Newcastle Chronicle and Journal, Lancashire Live and the Hull Daily Mail. If you want to know what's going on in Northern politics from a Northern perspective, you're in the right place. I'm Northern Agenda editor Rob Parsons, bringing you another episode of analysis and political commentary from the North. Later in the podcast, we'll be hearing from the Conservative MP James Grundy, who'll be telling us why he wants to separate his constituency of Leigh in Greater Manchester from the Labour-run borough of Wigan and go its own way.
There will be other places as well in the country who wish to see devolution brought down to the very local level, so we can basically direct the future path of our town in the most effective way. Because who are the best people to make the decision for the local community but those local communities?
But before that, why don't we talk a bit about the way we talk? The roots of regional dialects in different parts of the country go back for centuries, and these days in the north of England, local and regional identity are formed to a large extent by accents. They're a source of pride for many, part of what makes our region the vibrant and interesting place that it is. But analysis by a team of academics at Northumbria University suggests that there are many in this country for whom a northern accent, and this is pretty astonishing really, is actually a sign of being less intelligent, less educated and less ambitious. One of the findings from the British Academy-funded Speaking of Prejudice research project is that people form judgments about others purely based on the way they speak. I'd like to drill down into this, so we've got Dr. Robert McKenzie, one of the academics who carried out the study, to find out a bit more about it. Robert, it's nice to have you on.
It's a pleasure. It's my pleasure to speak. As a northern-based academic, I'm very pleased to come onto your programme.
Not at all. And given that I'm not actually northern and don't speak with a northern accent, despite my best efforts to flatten my vowels when I moved up to Leeds a decade ago, let's also bring in our producer Dan McLaughlin, a bona fide Lancastrian who doesn't just have a northern accent, but uses it to perform poetry at venues around Manchester and the Northwest. Hi, Dan.
I'm not going to put on an accent. Unfortunately, I'm stuck with this. I've tried to get rid of it, but for the best of my ability, but this is what you've got.
And there's no reason you should change it. No reason at all. So, Robert, can you first tell us a bit more about the study and why you decided to embark on it?
Okay, the project's called Speaking of Prejudice, and it's something we've been doing for 4 years, and we got funding from the British Academy to do this project. Basically, to give you a bit of background, the way that people speak it indexes other people's stereotypes of them. So, for example, we might say that German, for example, sounds harsh, perhaps if we're talking negatively, but strong. But French, on the other hand, sounds, let's say, sophisticated and romantic. Well, what we're really doing is that's accessing our stereotypes of French and German people. And, to take it back to the UK, there's a lot of studies in England in particular showing us that we stereotype the northern speakers. And, I'm very aware that there's a great variation within the north of England. I live in Newcastle and I'm hearing a northwest accent here, which is very different between the north and the south of England. And those stereotypes, if you like, those attitudes, if you like, they access ideas of the wider north and the wider south. So basically, by looking at language attitudes and looking at evaluations of linguistic varieties, we can hear something or we can learn something about what people think about their prejudices and their stereotypes, which they might not be able to access or at least express in other ways.
People's views about an accent is not necessarily a reflection on the implicit qualities of the accent. It's to some extent a reflection of the prejudices that people already have about the people from that area.
That's exactly. I mean, you've hit the nail on the head there. So, as linguists, we know that all varieties, all dialects, if you like, although we tend to use the word varieties, they're all systematic. None are more complex than others. They all have their complex rules. But, it's still possible to say, for example, in America, there's research in America that says, for example, many people think that African American English is uneducated and lazy, but they would never say that African American people are lazy and uneducated, or at least it's not socially acceptable to say that. But if it's socially acceptable to say these things about accents, then that means that we're just expressing our prejudices in another way.
So it's really a way for people to disguise their snobbery about certain parts of the country. They can't say that they think that Northerners are less educated, but they can say that their accent makes them sound less educated, which I guess is a slightly more polite way of saying the same thing.
Yeah, I mean, I would even go so far as to say it's not a polite way, because it's a way of taking away their voice. So if you look, for example, at some politicians, for example, Angela Rayner and Jess Phillips, well, they've been criticised for the way they speak by several newspapers and on Twitter, and it's kind of a way of diminishing their message. So, for example, if the message, if the accent or the variety is stigmatised, then they can take away their voice. They can say that the message that they have is also stigmatised and diminished. So and we know that these attitudes, these language attitudes, have social implications. So, for example, and I'll go in a bit wider again. That in court, for example, if you have a stigmatised accent, you're more likely to be found guilty of a crime, and particularly violent or petty crime, than someone with a so-called standard accent. You are more likely to be given lower marks by your teacher in a school if your school teacher thinks that you speak a denigrated accent. You're less likely to be given a job than a so-called standard speaker after an interview, and just generally, you're less likely to be believed. Your message is less likely to believe. So, it is kind of easy to come across as saying you're being po-faced and I've invented another ism, but it does have social implications for speakers.
So I guess with that being the case, you can understand why people might, as they move through the world, sort of soften the accent that they have if they've experienced what you've described, early in their lives, and they feel like they want to make a success of themselves. They might speak differently to enhance their chances of success.
I mean, soften's a really interesting word that you use. So, for example, strong and less strong accents, they're only based on some idea that people speak neutrally. And of course, people who say that they speak neutrally, they're the powerful ones. We speak normally and everyone else speaks funny. So these ideas of standard accents and non-standard accents, they really just represent social judgments of the speakers. And to say that people, if everybody should speak the same, or everybody should have so-called soft accents, it's kind of like 100 years ago. It's kind of like saying, or even earlier, or more recent, women should just man up a bit, and if the minority should whiten up a bit, and then there'd be no prejudice. I mean, it's exactly the same argument, really. So people base their prejudices on ideas of intelligibility. For example, there's no reason why, for example, a Manchester accent is not more intelligible than a Southern British Standard English accent, which we used to call a RP. There's no reason for that at all. It's just exposure. I mean, there's only two arguments there. For example, it could be that people are less exposed to the accent, so they have more difficulty understanding it. Or, on the other hand, it could be that Manchester accent is so complex for those other speakers that they can't understand it. And that's the only two possibilities. And of course, it's the first one.
Yeah, well, it has to be, really, doesn't it? Now, I was interested to see that people's attitudes to accent and the extent to which the phenomenon you describe is the case. It depends on age. What's the situation there?
Yeah, I mean, maybe I can give a quick overview of the results. What we found, we looked at Northern and English speech, and we didn't choose lots of vernacular. We didn't choose lots of dialects. What we did was we chose very educated speakers. So we chose what we might call a general Northern English accent, which is some accent from the north, or a variety from the north, which is spreading all over the north. And it's the kind of thing that you might hear on Northern media. For example, you might hear on Northern TV, you might hear in Northern courts, or you might hear Northern universities. So we chose that as the Northern, what we call stimulus. And in the Southern stimulus, we chose a Southern Standard English, British English speaker. So, considered educated accents, if you like. And what we did was we played those speech samples, and we said, what do you think? What do you think of these speakers? And that's what we call self-reported attitude. So we just asked their opinion. And what we found, in line with what we've found for the last 50 years, is that in terms of status, the Southern English. So status means traits like intelligence, education, ambition. We found that, English nationals, 350 of them from all over England, tended to rate the Southern speaker higher on intelligence and status. But on the other hand, they rated the Northern speaker, the general Northern English speaker, higher in terms of friendliness and trustworthiness, honesty, pleasantness, etc. So we call that social attractiveness. So there's these two dimensions, social attractiveness and status, and they kind of compensate for each other. So we might say, for example, speakers in Newcastle sound friendly, but they can be often or sometimes diminished in terms of perceptions of, richness or poverty or, yeah. Okay, and then what we also did, and this is, perhaps a bit more novel, we looked at their implicit attitudes. We measured underneath the ideas which they may not be aware of, their perceptions that they may not be aware of. And we use something called an implicit association test. And that's where a computer-based test where we measure their reaction times to associate different accents with different adjectives and their quickness to do that. And the idea is the quicker you can associate a speech sample with positive traits or positive adjectives, the quicker you are. And we found at more implicit levels or more deeply embedded levels, if you like, that the Southern English speech was much more positively evaluated in both terms of status and social attractiveness. So underneath these, compensatory attitudes, there was much more negativity towards the North, and that was rather surprising for us because it kind of harks back to maybe 50 years ago. And just to finish that, there's in terms of age, we found age differences that younger people, although they weren't overwhelmingly positive towards the North, they were more tolerant, if you like, towards Northern English accents than their older peers, which kind of suggests that there might be some attitude change in progress towards a greater tolerance towards the North. And that's a good sign. So we think these attitudes are changing, but very slowly.
Yeah, that's really interesting. Now, Dan, let's bring you in at this point. I could see you nodding vigorously during while Robert was talking there. Now, you work in the media, obviously, and you perform in venues in Northern England. I mean, does what Robert say, what he's saying there, does that ring true for you? Have you experienced this sort of bias against Northern accents that Robert is describing there?
Yeah, absolutely. Everything that you were saying, like you said, Rob, I was nodding along vigorously at some point. In my job in the media, I would tend to use what Dr. McKenzie was saying was the status. I need status, whereas in my life as a performer, I need the social attractiveness. So in my professional life, I feel like my accent can be a hindrance. So not necessarily my accent, but people's attitudes towards my accent would be the hindrance. It's an old school Blackburn accent, what I've got. But when I'm on stage as a performer, that friendliness, that trustworthiness, that humour, I think the Lancashire accent is associated with humour. I was told when I did my journalism training that I'll never read news at 10. And there are some regional accents that could work with that. So there are certain Scottish accents, Welsh accents, Irish accents that are great for broadcast journalism, but they're told something like a Lancashire accent. You could do a comedy programme, but you couldn't necessarily do a news programme. And I think that was a cultural thing in terms of, you see Peter Kay, Paddy McGuinness, that sort of thing. Those Northern voices are in the comedy. But in terms of the status accent, mine doesn't seem to be complicit with the expectations of what they want.
That's really interesting. I mean, it's interesting about different accents being perhaps seen by some as more appropriate to different types of media. And, the BBC's latest political editor is a guy called Chris Mason, who has quite a strong Yorkshire accent. And but yeah, generally speaking, the people that you see reading the news are more likely to have what you describe as sort of an RP kind of accent. Robert, I gather that a long-term aim of your project is for accent to be designated as a protected characteristic under equality legislation. What's the thinking behind that, and how would you go about doing that?
That's a great question. That's exactly what we're thinking of doing. So, for example, if gender, for example, and disability is a protected characteristic, then and we're not allowed to be, or we can legislate against that. If you feel you don't get your job because of your gender, then maybe you should have a right to claim for your accent and your accent too. And if accent is a protected characteristic, the way to do this would be to find an MP, for example, to put a document into the House of Commons library, and then we would have a debate on accent discrimination, and then it could be included in the equality law. So it's a long-term aim. I mean, part of the aim as well is to increase people's understanding of the implications of accents, of accent bias, if you like, or negative attitudes towards negative accent, because we just had a lovely description there of the life chances of someone from Manchester, yeah, or someone from the Northwest. I mean, we make those choices. You can't read the news at 10. You're from the Northwest. I mean, to me, that's heartbreaking. Yeah. If we said you can't read the news at 10, for example, or the BBC News because you're a female or because you're an ethnic minority, there would be uproar. But we can say these things about accents.
I have to say that the idea of it as a protected characteristic, I think, would be vitally important, because my accent is not only a gateway into my geography, it's a gateway into my culture, my history, obviously my parental lineage, but also the rich history of where I'm from, where it's been, and where it's going.
Yeah.
And if we can protect buildings, we should be looking to protect the accent, because that's the gateway to that history.
Yeah, I mean, if you soften your accent, or take an accent reduction course, I mean, basically you're damaging part of your identity and the identity of those around you.
Absolutely.
I mean, some people do try and soften their accent. Some people do take accent reduction courses, because of course it might be helpful for them on a personal basis, but on a community level, those problems still exist.
Yeah, that's a very good point. Now, I guess part of what goes into the question of what is a northern accent, to get to that, you have to decide what is the north of England, first of all, which is a heated debate. Before we went on air, I was describing what I thought the constituted the boundary of the north of England. But this was another thing that you were looking at as well, Robert, and you got quite a few different responses, didn't you?
Yeah, I mean, as well as looking at age differences and gender differences, we also look in attitudes. We also looked at differences between whether the participants, the listeners, people who took part in the study, they thought they were from the north and from the south. And one interesting thing we did find, even people from the Midlands, we asked them, do you affiliate with the north, the south, or other? And most people, even from the Midlands, would say they affiliated with the north. And the further down you came from the country, like right down to the Midlands, the more, the further the geography, the boundary seemed to be with the north. So, my students, for example, in Newcastle, they think the north ends somewhere south of Middlesbrough, or just maybe somewhere north of Middlesbrough. But, for example, if I said that Sheffield was in the north, they would disagree with me. And of course, people from Sheffield would never say they're from the Midlands or the south. So all the way down to Derbyshire and Lincolnshire, people were saying, I affiliate with the north, which kinds of, in terms of linguistics, kind of shows that perhaps those accents around the West Midlands and the East Midlands are also, they trigger stereotypes about, in the same way, of high social attractiveness and low status. Indeed, for 50 years, we've found in kind of more explicit self-reported research that Birmingham itself seems to be the bête noire of English accents. It's in some way considered a little bit more rootless by some people, and the others, because it's not part of the wider northern identity, but in other ways it doesn't have the status as well. But hopefully, programs like Peaky Blinders might be having a positive effect on that. And another thing we also found is that when we actually talk to people, were becoming increasingly positive towards the Manchester accent, and that might be because I've been a few times to Manchester over the 30 years. Every time I go back to Manchester, it seems more economically prosperous and powerful, and you can tell that just from the height of the buildings. And perhaps because status evaluations reflect accent evaluations of power, then perhaps the Manchester accent itself will be increasingly thought of as more favourable And indeed, we know from general Northern English, this general Northern English variety, which seems to be spreading throughout the north more and more and more, that has many features of Manchester English.
It's funny you say that. It's exactly what I hear from back home. Is a lot of the younger people are picking up a Manchester accent, or as you said, it's general Northern accent, and maybe it is that reclamation of power. I just wanted to add as well that you get a lot of people who say that they're proudly Northern, but it's very rare to hear someone say I'm proudly Southern. Just sort of, we all like an outsider. We all like the difference as well.
I mean, I kind of look at it in terms of, so for example, if being Scottish, I hear quite often in the media, that Englishness and Britishness is conflated, and this is quite confusing as a Scottish person. But I kind of hear often, being in England, that the southernness represents Englishness. So if southern, the very idea of the home counties being home, isn't it, and the north being other. So I mean, central to the idea of, and I don't want to lecture you on Englishness, but central to the idea of Englishness seems to be the north-south divide, and the north as other, something different, and something outside. And I think that's quite an interesting concept. So as Britishness perhaps recedes and the idea of Englishness is on the rise, then I think this northern-southern English binary distinction is evolving.
Quite often I'm asked about what are the issues that bind Northerners together, like what are the common things that all Northerners feel. And obviously that's quite a hard question to answer because the North is such a diverse and vibrant place. But I think it is probably the case that one of the things that defines Northernness is that simple binary distinction of not being London, not being in London, being that physical distance and that metaphorical distance away from London. And that is part of how maybe some, if not necessarily all, Northerners define themselves. And you see that in the way that some northern politicians use that distinction, kind of thinking of Andy Burnham maybe and others, to bolster their political brand. But that's I guess a wider question that goes beyond just accents and more into economic prosperity and things like that. Robert, I could talk about this all day. It's such a fascinating subject, but it's been great talking to you. So the study is called Speaking of Prejudice, and it's funded by the British Academy. And is there an academic paper out that you can point people in the direction of?
Well, that's very kind of you. In the next couple of weeks, we've got a book coming out, and the results. And we discussed the idea of Northernness and the results of the study. It's called Implicit and Explicit Language Attitudes: Mapping Linguistic Prejudice and Attitude Change in England, by myself and Andrew McNeill, and it's out with Routledge.
Fantastic stuff. Dr. Robert McKenzie, thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Dave. It was a pleasure.
So Northern Conservatives gathered in Doncaster last week for a big conference to exchange ideas that they hope might give voters in our region a reason to repeat the backing they gave to Boris Johnson in 2019. The Prime Minister wasn't there himself though. He was called away for a meeting in the Ukraine, and there are those in the party starting to worry that his flagship domestic agenda of levelling up is starting to gradually work its way down his to-do list as he wrestles with a cost of living crisis gripping the country and other big issues. So let's hear from one of the Northern Conservatives who formed part of Mr Johnson's spectacular election success in the so-called Red Wall, the Leigh MP James Grundy. James is the first ever Conservative to represent the constituency and will, at the next election, I'm sure, be wanting to show voters in his part of Greater Manchester that they were right to change their allegiance. So, James, welcome to our podcast.
Hello. Good to see you today, Rob.
It's good to have you on. So, let's start with levelling up, shall we? Now, obviously, as I was alluding to, there have been some pretty major headwinds the government's been facing: the pandemic, the cost of living crisis. In your constituency, would you say that levelling up is happening? And if it's not happening, why isn't it happening in your view?
I would say already that there are some projects being put in place and some things that have been stopped, actually, which I think demonstrate that levelling up is still at the heart of the government's agenda. I mean, obviously, one of the main things is for decades, people were talking about the need to reopen Goulburn railway station, and the government basically provided 14 million from if I remember correctly, the Transforming Cities Fund to get Goulburn Station reopened. Now, that's something that Andy Burnham was in Tony Blair's government as a cabinet member. It didn't happen. Within a couple of years of getting a Conservative MP, we've got that money. And so the people of Goulburn, since the 1960s, when their local station was shut, we're getting it back. And in many ways, that's a test bed for getting back a station for Leigh, which of course famously doesn't have a railway station. It's one of the largest towns in the country not to. And obviously there are projects along those lines which we're looking at all across the country. I know Grant Shapps has been talking about the Restoring Your Railways projects recently. That's the kind of stuff that people want to see in terms of levelling up. It's bricks and mortar projects that deliver for local communities, that clearly have needs for projects of that type, and feel that over however many decades that they've been wanting them, they just haven't been delivered for one reason or another.
There's this pot of money, isn't there? 4.8 billion, the Levelling Up Fund, devoted to regeneration projects in places across the country. But now I know Wigan Council, which is Labour run, put forward a bid for a project last year, I think, or the year before, that involved a multi-storey car park. But you didn't support that, and it never got any funding from the government, as far as I'm aware. Now, I'm sure you'd like Leigh to benefit from this £5 billion pound fund. But if local leaders are going to bid for more of this cash, which is, I think, happening in the next few weeks with the second round of the fund, I mean, what kind of things would you like Wigan and Leigh should be bidding for on behalf of people in your town? Not a multi-storey car park, I assume.
There are a couple of things. First of all, Leigh Market is reaching the end of its current life. It's looking very tired and down at heel. That's something we would want to see regenerated, a la Altrincham Market or indeed Warrington Market. Those are some very good nearby examples of how this refurbishment of a local market in the heart of a town can bring levelling up in practice to town. So as I say, there have been some very impressive examples of this in Tyldesley in the east of my constituency. And we're looking at doing something similar in Leigh Town Centre, where we're basically bringing the high street back to life, with sort of new shop fronts, sort of guided by a design and style guide to keep it coherent and all the shop fronts in keeping with each other, so that people can have a high street that brings a sense of pride again, rather than looking like sort of a row of broken teeth. That is another one of the projects, and of course, I think there's also been some proposals around sort of refurbishment of the town square outside the library and town hall, which I think is also impressive. I think we're obviously quite close to submitting a bid at the moment, and quite a lot of the suggestions that I and Leigh Means Business brought forward have been incorporated into the bid. But we do have some concerns. Obviously, Leigh is priority one in terms of levelling up funding, which means we're entitled to £20 million worth of funding. But it does look at the minute that Wigan Council's bid for Leigh will only be roughly £10-11 million worth. And I do feel that leaving almost half the money on the table is probably a bit substandard. I think we should be aiming for as much of that 20 million as possible. Secondly, I mean, there are a couple of concerns about the phasing and delivery of that scheme. I know that sort of what we're talking about at the moment is closure of Leigh Market for a year while the refurbishment takes place, but the alternative space is only a fifth the size of that. So what you would be looking at, I think, and certainly what the market traders have been saying, is that they're very concerned that during the year the market's closed, given there's inadequate space for them to transfer into during that refurbishment, the danger is that the custom simply goes somewhere else, and we end up with a new building but no market because the traders either have moved on or the customers have moved on. And so I think there's more work to be done on sort of phasing of that project and sort of finding a viable alternative to the market location whilst the refurbishment takes place, which of course is desperately needed and everyone supports that. In terms of with what we would do with the remainder of that money, is the one thing that came up from the existing businesses and potential future businesses in Leigh is, at the minute, there's a lack of a sort of a big draw, that's something to improve footfall in the town centre to drive businesses to the refurbished high street and the refurbished market, which of course are good ideas and ideas that we suggested to Wigan Council as an alternative to their multi-storey car park idea. And I think that is the missing piece of the puzzle at the moment, that there needed to be a large centrepiece project to sort of drive footfall in the town centre.
Now, you were talking about your relationship with Wigan Council, which I think brings us quite nicely onto the issue of Lexit, which I know is a passion of yours. Leigh has been part of Wigan Borough since the local government reorganisation in 1974, but you would like to see it separate from the borough of Wigan and form its own authority. And I know you've been in talks with Michael Gove about this, and you've had the support of Boris Johnson in Prime Minister's questions, if I remember rightly. Where are things at with it at the moment?
Well, as it happens, this very afternoon, before I met you, I had a meeting with Kemi Badenoch, the local government minister, and we had a discussion about this very issue. So very, very pertinent timing to ask me this question. I mean, the long story short, I mean, the local government reorganisation, I think, came into effect in 1973, and the council started operation in 1974. Well, the people of Leigh have never felt that Wigan really represents their interests because, of course, whilst we are neighbouring towns, we're also rival towns, friendly rivals, but nonetheless, we have rival rugby teams. There are two major towns within the conurbation. Depending on which metric you use, some might say Leigh is larger than Wigan, depending on which suburbs you include as part of Leigh and Wigan, respectively. But of course, culturally, the Makerfield area, which lies between Wigan and Leigh, is culturally part of Wigan, even if not part of the town itself. And so it feels like we've always been a minority in the borough. It feels like we are the second stringers, the second class citizens. And I think there's been a lot of issues recently around, we've been talking about town centre regeneration. Wigan Council, of course, has a project where they're spending 200 million on the regeneration of Wigan town centre. And people have rightly said in Leigh, well, where's Leigh's 200 million? What about us? Surely if we're equals, we'd be getting the same amount of money spent on the regeneration of our town centre. I think it's a fair comment. So, I mean, these have been questions that have been posed by the public regarding our future since the very creation of Wigan Borough, and of course, at the time, there were a number of these debates that went on. Famously, Bury was initially proposed to be merged with Rochdale. People of Bury mounted a campaign to stay out of Rochdale. They were successful. There were people in Warrington who, I think Warrington was initially proposed to be part of Greater Manchester. They campaigned to keep themselves out of Greater Manchester successfully. And indeed, not just historic debates on this. Yesterday, my colleague Robbie Moore, MP Keighley, put forward a bill in Parliament. Sorry, it wasn't yesterday, it was Monday, regarding local referendums for people who wanted to form their own local authority. And I can tell you now, I think I'll be supporting that bill wholeheartedly as an alternative mechanism for getting out of Wigan Borough. Should my attempts with the department not necessarily bear fruit, but I'm very optimistic they will. And of course, over in Merseyside, Southport is currently I won't say agitating. The people of Southport are very genteel, nice people. I don't think they necessarily get very agitated about very much, but they are campaigning to get out of Merseyside and back into Lancashire. They have been doing so for some time, and I know Damien Moore, the MP there, is is very keen to progress that issue. He feels that not only Sefton Council but Merseyside as a whole doesn't necessarily represent the best interests of Southport, which obviously is on the very outermost edge of Merseyside, and that Southport has far more in common with the neighbouring parts of Lancashire in South Ribble and West Lancs. These are debates that are going on all across the country, and the thing is, if devolution means anything, it means local people being able to take control of the decisions that affect their town, sometimes for a couple of years in the future, sometimes for a generation, major decisions. And I think the thing is, we're talking about, we've seen a lot of regional devolution already. My view has always been that's an incomplete version of devolution, where, if you're creating mayors with centralised powers, then the boroughs that are beneath those mayors, we perhaps need to reassess the purpose of those boroughs. And of course, there are still savings to be made, because you can do things like centralised payroll to defray the cost of reorganisation. And we have seen in, there are some places where bigger authorities have been formed. And in Cumbria recently, Cumbria County Council was broken up. We've seen 2 smaller authorities in Cumbria. I think that the thing is, what is the best form of local government for your community? And we do have quite a patchwork across the country, where in some places, my good friend Chris Green, the MP for Bolton West and Allerton, says that virtually all of his constituency has parish councils, because it's largely made up, even though its official name is Bolton West, but obviously contains part of Allerton as well, which I have the other half, that the entirety of the Bolton West part is not actually the town of Bolton. It's largely places like Horwich and West Horton, and most of that is parished, because those communities, whilst they feel a cultural affinity to Bolton, do want some control over local decision making, especially parish and town councils. That tends to be sort of granular things like the ability to organise local events and placement of flower pots and things like that. Stuff that may seem trivial in the grand scheme of things, but are very important to local people in terms of the ability to shape what their community looks like, and in terms of community pride as well. I think that in terms of sort of the prospects for local government reform, there's a lot of things in the mix at the minute, and it's not just in Leigh that things like Lexit are being talked about, because of course we've talked about Robbie Moore in Keighley and his neighbour Philip Davies in Shipley. We've talked about my colleague Damien Moore in Southport. Obviously there's Lexit. There will be other places as well in the country who wish to see devolution brought down to the very local level, so we can basically direct the future path of our town in the most effective way. Because who are the best people to make the decision for the local community but those local communities?
And so you were saying, just talking about Robbie Moore, the legislation that he's brought before Parliament this week. So is what you're saying that if your talks with the government aren't successful in bringing Lexit about, you might try and use legislation that prompts a referendum to achieve the same goal? As
I say, I mean, the talks are progressing quite productively at the moment with the government, but obviously any alternative mechanism such as that proposed in Robbie Moore's legislation is extremely welcome. Because obviously there are. I'll go through the current mechanism actually, which is, and it fits very neatly actually with what Robbie's proposing with local referendums, which is that you must demonstrate public support for your proposal, which I think is very easy. I mean, you just need to go around Leigh Town Centre and speak to ordinary people, and if you ask them, do you want Leigh to have its own local authority back, people will say yes. There's no doubt about that. The second part of that formula is viability. Now, it's whether or not the new authority would be viable as a local authority, which of course is and as part of the meeting today, the minister will be writing to me outlining the precise meaning of viability, public support. And the third factor, obviously, is sign off by the government, which if you met the first two, then the third is pretty much a given. So, and I think Robbie's proposal actually is a great mechanism to deliver on part one, which is demonstrating public support. Because obviously, at the moment, what is the mechanism to demonstrate public support? Is it a petition? Is it people writing letters? I think formalising that part of the mechanism through a referendum where people wish to separate from their local authority is a good one. And I think in terms of constitutional reform, over the past decade, we've seen a number of referendums. Famously, of course, the Brexit one. But not only that, there was the one on the Greater Manchester Clean Air Zone charge, and of course we had the Scottish independence referendum, going all the way back to '99, of course, with the referendums on whether to set up a Scottish Parliament and Welsh Assembly, and I think actually they're a relatively good barometer to judge people's opinions. Famously, of course, in Leigh, turnout in the Brexit referendum was higher than at any subsequent general election, which just goes to show that actually people do care about these issues, and you can get a pretty decent takeaway of what people's opinions are by holding a formal referendum on some of these subjects.
Now, the other big issue for you locally, I know, is the Golborne link. So that's the 13-mile, £3 billion spur connecting the Crewe to Manchester HS2 line to the West Coast Main Line near Golborne, which is south of Wigan. Now, yourself and a few other local MPs have been quite outspoken in opposing it because of the impact it would have on your constituencies. And of course, this month, the government decided it was going to scrap the Golborne link. But you'll have seen, I'm sure, that Vale industry leaders fear that this bit of line was crucial to creating extra capacity on the railways, and they worry that this decision will create a bottleneck for trains and negatively affect passengers and freight going up and down the country. Do you accept that this might have been good news for your constituents, scrapping the Golborne link, but there's a risk that it might end up being a bad thing for the railway network as a whole?
Well, I must say I'm disappointed at the rail industry for popping off like this straight away before they've seen the alternatives that the government is looking at. And I shall also add, even though I don't have to declare it anymore, I shall declare my interest. My family was one of the many thousands in Loughton and Goulburn that were affected negatively by the route of the spur. I've been campaigning on this issue for 10 years. But I think going back to our earlier topic, we were talking about Leigh as second-class citizens versus Wigan. People in Loughton and Goulburn were going absolutely crackers about the Goulburn spur. It absolutely hammered the local area. Thousands of houses affected, hundreds of jobs lost at a demolished industrial estate, and colossal environmental damage. Well, Wigan Council backed the Goulburn spur because it was good for Wigan. Well, great for Wigan, but what about us? And it was like the attitude from Wigan Council was, well, you'll just have to suck it up because this is good for the town centre of Wigan. And we were just expected to sort of eat all the losses while Wigan Town Centre got the benefits. So it's just another example of how Leigh and the surrounding communities are treated as second-class citizens by Wigan Council. I think that obviously there are a number of proposals that have come forward now as an alternative to the Goulburn spur. One of which has already received some broad cross-party support from a number of people, which is to upgrade the West Coast Main Line through Warrington. One of the big downsides of the Goulburn spur was that it effectively bypassed Warrington. Now, in the long term, this would have meant fewer services running from Warrington down to London, which would have basically turned Warrington into a regional backwater in the fullness of time. So it was colossally opposed on a cross-party basis in Warrington by every party and all MPs of whatever colour. It was really detrimental to places like Warrington. And of course in Trafford as well, around Warburton Village, people opposed it there. I think there were people in rural Cheshire opposing it there as well. Literally everyone along the route of that track opposed it, with whatever political stripe you could name. with the exception of Wigan Council, whose attitude was, you all get stuff, this is good for us. And I think it illustrates the kind of attitude that Wigan Council has, to the point where they obviously had an influence on the Labour MP for Makerfield putting forward an amendment on Monday night, which in the end was not moved, that attempted to get the Goulburn Spur back into the bill in the teeth of opposition from literally everybody else along the route of that spur. I think that it's all very well for the Rail Industry Association to volunteer about half a dozen communities along the route of the Goulburn Spur for devastation for the interest of their industry. But I suspect those very same people, if the Goulburn Spur had been running through their communities in a way that wasn't very effective or value or indeed value for money, as both the Union Connectivity Review and the Integrated Rail Plan said, independent reports that said the Goulburn Spur wasn't up to scratch. I suspect those people would have been signing petitions and writing angry letters in their communities. I think the Rail Industry Association and others, just are completely out of touch with ordinary people on this, especially when, as I say, there is this other option on the table, which is to upgrade the West Coast Main Line through Warrington, which actually means Wigan loses nothing, Scotland loses nothing, Warrington gains, and it's far less impactful on a string of communities that would have been horrendously impacted by the Goulburn Spur had it gone ahead.
James Grundy, thank you very much.
Thank you very much.
Thank you for listening to the Northern Agenda podcast, and don't forget you can subscribe to our daily newsletter at thenorthernagenda.co.uk. It's more important than ever for Northern voices to be heard. The Northern Agenda is a laudable production for Reach. It's presented by me, Rob Parsons, and Dan O'Donoghue, and it's produced by Daniel J. McLaughlin. If you enjoyed this episode, please subscribe to The Northern Agenda wherever you listen to your podcasts, including Apple and Spotify. Also, check out the other Laudable podcasts. See you next week. Bye-bye.